Hello, I'm Gui.
I'm a fifth.
And I'm Long.
And you're listening to Kopi Overflow, a podcast about software engineering. Heads up announcement.
Breaking news.
But yeah, I guess announcement is that the podcast will go on indefinite hiatus. That's what they all say, indefinite hiatus.
That's one way to say that.
That's a code for we're stopping the show basically. Not this episode, of course. We've planned out ahead of schedule. So our last episode will be episode 23. So there will be 3 more episodes after this. We'll talk more about the meta stuff about the podcast in probably the last episode, and like how we feel about the podcast and things that we learn. I'm slowly like compiling a list about that as well. Yeah, so that's that. Probably you all listeners are rejoicing now. You don't have to pretend to support us even though you're our friend.
I don't have friends.
Still, thanks for all the support all this while.
So with the big announcement out of the way,
I guess since we will stop our podcast soon, we want to take this chance to have this one episode where we bring our own topics and we could just go wild.
fancy hearing you say that long when you didn't prepare any topic.
Shh, nobody has to know that.
Okay, so I guess this is one of the things that we talked about before the episode, but I guess we can bring it up again. So me and Gui are working in a Ruby shop. One thing that we notice, it's really hard to find Ruby devs. So if you're out there wanting to learn Ruby, this is the right moment. So yeah, we were talking about like how hard it is to actually find good Ruby developers.
It doesn't even have to be good, like any Ruby developer.
Any Ruby developers, yeah.
Not that anyone would want to hire bad engineers, but it's just that we're talking about the funnel doesn't even exist, right? Like you can throw a stone and you will hit a JS developer anytime.
Ouch!
But you try to find a Ruby developer, they're non-existent.
Are you throwing a stone at Long? Because he's a JS dev.
I'm the only non-Ruby guy here, so I'll just sit quietly here.
Maybe we should get you to learn Ruby.
This is practically a Ruby promotion podcast.
So fun fact, a couple of years ago, I think, they did a survey and seems like Ruby devs are the highest paid one. So
Do you remember which survey is it? Is it the Stack Overflow one or
I cannot remember, but maybe we can find out and then include the link in the
show notes? Yeah.
But that's an actual study. Just like some extrinsic motivation for you to get started learning Ruby.
Yeah, I was about to say, do you remember like what's the first language? Is it something very obscure like COBOL, like the highest paid?
I cannot remember what was
Yeah, because if JS is the highest one, it kind of like totally defeats the point of us talking about it.
I don't think it will be JS, no.
Because there's so many, it's like, oh, it's so easy to hire JS. Let's suppress JS developers.
Yeah, I don't think JS is.
There's no scarcity to, hike up the price.
I was wondering whether it's a geographical thing as well for us being in like Southeast Asia. Specifically talking about Southeast Asia lah. Maybe it's harder because it feels like maybe US and to a certain extent Europe might have an easier time hiring. I'm not too sure.
I don't think so. My current company now has a Europe presence. And yeah, we're actually opening the hiring to globally remote opportunities because of it's hard to find Ruby devs there and here in Asia.
I'm wondering whether does this like contribute to also
The salary being higher?
No. There is like a supply and demand component inside the salary, right? Because there isn't enough Ruby engineers. But I'm wondering whether this would help in some ways motivate more services companies. Because I think before this, you were working in a service company that does Ruby dev, right? And also there are a lot other like bigger services company. Current organization I work with also hire developers from services company as well. So I wonder whether that will like also kind of motivate services company to offer more engineers. But I guess they will also face the same problem where they can't hire engineers to provide services to other companies.
So in a way, like other companies who want to, I guess, initiate or work on some Ruby project instead of hiring engineers, they're hiring all these product company have to share the pool.
I don't think that's the case though. Yeah. So I think there's another interesting fact is that was it 50%? I think 50% companies that come out of YC. YC is Y Combinator, one of the more famous startup incubators, right? I think 50% of them use Ruby. They probably hoarded more Ruby devs than like all these services companies, like consultancy companies. I'm not sure.
I guess building on what you said, I think a lot of times Y Combinator companies, their founders use this language because it's very easy to prototype and get things working, right? And then when they reach a certain scale, they either move away or continue to invest into these stacks. But I also wonder whether it is because it is a more approachable language and framework, like Rails is batteries included, right? You can run with it. Of course, you could say that with a lot of other frameworks as well, Django and Laravel. Would you disagree?
I disagree with the word a lot because there's not many other frameworks that actually have batteries included, like the level of Rails and Laravel. I think Laravel is probably one of the other ones that have this all battery included. So even like I would probably identify myself as a JavaScript developer first, even though I'm working in a Ruby shop. But I have to admit that I cannot find a backend JavaScript framework that has all the batteries included, like how Rails has it. And that's another thing about the JS community as well, because there's so many frameworks. Like backend frameworks alone, there are a lot, and front end frameworks you don't even have to say. Backend frameworks, you have like Adonis, Sails, Feathers, Express. Express is definitely not battery included, even though there's a lot of plugins that can help you get your stuff done. It's definitely a more
Fragmented, you mean?
fragmented. Yes, that's the word, right? So everything you have to kind of like,
You have to wire everything.
yeah, you have to wire everything yourself.
You have to put things together.
You have to buy the batteries. You have to plug in the batteries everywhere.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think Adonis is probably the closest one, but even then, it's not at the level of Laravel and Rails, I think.
But I think that goes back to what you're looking for, right, as a developer. Because I think the philosophy behind Rails is convention over configuration. And if you are someone who would like to configure and customize your own things, then maybe you wouldn't like it that much. But a lot of the things like what you guys brought up earlier, like when you want to prototype something quickly, you don't want to think about your own opinions. Just take someone's opinions, go with it, and get it work, right?
Yeah, that's probably why Rails is more famous in like the prototyping world.
And coming back to my point about like business, more like non-technical co-founders would also be involved in it because it's more straightforward to pick up. So one example is like a product manager that I've not exactly worked with, but in the organization I worked in before, one of the product managers, they studied in a non-technical background. I think they did like finance or business or something like that. Right, and then they joined this startup, and then they picked up Ruby on Rails, and then became an engineer, and then after that switched roles to a product manager when the opportunity arises. I think, for example, the batteries included that we just talked about, and also maybe the accessibility of Ruby probably helped a lot in that as well. She used to work in banking and finance, and then became like an engineer. Oh wait, before she joined them, she like went to boot camps because she wanted to she saw like tech startup was a thing, then she saw the potential there, then she like trained herself to be an engineer.
I do agree with you about the approachable language feature of Ruby. I've tried a lot of languages, right? Java, Scala, JavaScript, Ruby. I do agree that Ruby is probably one of the most approachable languages. Very easy to read, looks clean, very concise. Some languages are very verbose, and some languages are kind of too low level, I think. And then like Ruby kind of have like balance in the middle. It's definitely one of the more friendlier ones, I think. I think Python is also one of the languages that are like that, and it's probably one of the reasons why Python is also very popular among the people who just trying to jump into programming, right?
Yeah, it's really a chicken and egg thing, right? Like, yeah, there's definitely a few engineers I've spoken to, again, mostly from Ruby organizations, and then they're like, it's hard to hire, maybe we want to change stack already. Like, seriously considering if a change of stack is more worthwhile, just because like again it's easier to hire JS developers. I feel like I'm bringing down JS developers' worth just by saying there's a lot of them.
Ouch.
Oh, but one thing I do want to bring up was education as well. Whether education plays a role into this. So for example, you mentioned about Python, right? I did notice. So when I was in university, for example, I did Java as like the first year programming language, for example. And recently means few years back, 2-3 years back, I kind of looked at the existing syllabus of my university, and they were offering Python as the beginning language for undergraduates. I think maybe that's one thing that is one factor where there are a lot more like fresh graduates would know a specific language, because like the trend towards like what languages and what frameworks are being used. Yeah, and another thing is, for example, locally, I'm not sure whether they're still doing it, but there is like a local government related body. So their objective is, I think, to encourage and
Incubate.
Yeah, incubate, yes. Encourage and incubate like tech sector overall. And with that, they offer boot camps as well. Like I think previously, they were using Ruby as a language as well. I think that was time where you will get a lot of fresh engineers that would have Ruby and Rails knowledge, because it was something that taught. Then I think after that, they shift to Python. But I'm not sure whether the bootcamp is still running now. Totally not keeping up with it. I think that's also one factor where it influenced this influx of Python now instead of like Ruby developers. Maybe Afif, you agree, I'm not sure. Definitely would like to hear your thought about this, because I think ever since like the government linked bodies stopped offering Ruby as a language, that was maybe 5 years back, for example, that's when we start to see like a drought of Ruby talent. So this comes back to the supply and demand and the chicken and egg thing, right? Because there's like, there's all this growing field, data science, data engineering, AI, ML, all requires Python and all the surrounding libraries around that, not to say no other languages do, but Python seems to be in the place where everybody's doing this work. Then that's why like, there's opportunity there. Then maybe education starts shifting their mind towards this. Then of course you will have more fresh graduates or fresh engineers with Python knowledge that can meet the job market demand. And where's all these Ruby companies? Like, if you think about it locally, there aren't a lot of Ruby companies also. You can barely fit two hands.
Is that why we never have a shortage of JS developer? Because even though like all this higher education or whatever, at least from my personal experience, I haven't seen anyone who learned JavaScript in school, but eventually you have to use it because it's the language of the web, of the browser. So everyone has to learn it.
I think so. Like if you go into like basic web development, then it's like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Like, even though it's on front end, and then you think like, I can use the same thing for back end, then just like,
yeah, don't need to learn a new language.
Plus JavaScript developers give themselves job security, right? Every day there's new framework. There's a new framework I need to learn.
I feel like I'm taking multiple arrows in this episode.
I realized that every language has its own bad habits. So for example, in the Ruby world, the bad habit is excessive metaprogramming. So I don't know why, but metaprogramming is something that Ruby devs liked a lot, but it's really, really something that I think is made easier by Ruby, and then therefore people find it and it's like, this is a great thing, we want to do it everything metaprogramming way, and then just bites them back in the butt. And then JavaScript world, the fragmented community is probably the bad habit. Like you have front-end frameworks after front-end frameworks, back-end frameworks after back-end frameworks.
But if you learn everything, it's not fragmented anymore, right? You just need to learn React, Vue, Svelte.
Nobody can learn everything. Like for example, like Ruby, there's very little choices that are prominent. So if you use Ruby, chances are you probably use Rails. There might be some Sinatra and then some Hanami. That's it. In the front end, JavaScript world, don't even have to describe.
But that's not about the language, right? That's about the community and ecosystem around the language. And because this JavaScript community is so big, everyone has their opinion. But that's bad part of JavaScript in the language itself. Like, I mean, we have a whole book from Douglas Crawford, I think, the JavaScript, the good part, that's explain like some good and bad parts of JavaScript. Yeah.
I mean, Java, we have a lot of Java devs as well, but you don't hear that many Java frameworks. Like there's always like Spring Boot, then what?
Play is like exceptionally rare, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean,
but I think everybody just use Spring Boot. Everybody just like surrender their fate to like Java, just like Spring Boot.
Yeah, so like PHP devs, like oh my god, you don't hear that many. Actually, it used to have a lot, yeah.
It used to have a lot, I guess it's just like converging
towards like Laravel, yeah. So maybe one day JavaScript will become like that. So like,
nah, everybody have different opinions.
I think on the front end side we have. Also the barrier to entry to JavaScript is lower than...
But they're not the same.
Yeah, I don't think Long implied that.
They're not the same.
You're not talking about like front end web development comparison. You're just talking about language as a comparison.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though these front-end frameworks use the same language, their paradigm is really different.
I wouldn't say it's a topic change, but one thing I did want to bring up was when we talk about like front-end, like JavaScript being the language of the web, whatever that means. I think WebAssembly is something I'm keen to look at, but I have no knowledge of. But I think a lot more languages start to support it. There are some movement in Rust doing that as well. Ruby 3.2 is adding WebAssembly support as well. So that's an interesting area. Maybe one day I can achieve my dream of never touching JavaScript.
Why don't you want to touch JavaScript? It's great.
With all the points we just talked about.
Just kidding. I'm just pushing your Ruby buttons.
Are we turning this into like a Ruby versus JavaScript podcast episode?
This episode is really a Ruby podcast already. This is one thing I'm keen and interested about. I have no knowledge about it. It feels very new, but definitely some area I want to explore. Finding talent, especially for a very, I wouldn't say niche but comparatively not a quote-unquote mainstream language would be a bit of challenge. And even though there's a lot of things we can do, in the end, ultimately it comes back to market demand. If there's not enough companies, there's not enough areas that want to using a specific language, then probably cause them to like either change tag or do something like that. So, what's the next topic, Long?
I wanted to talk about accessibilities, but I'm not sure where to even start.
Okay, one thing that I've been doing recently is I'm rereading the book Accelerate. It's basically The same authors who wrote Phoenix Project, they have been doing State of DevOps research report every year. And then I think in 2017, they took like a few years of research results and then compiled that into what they observe in like high performing software companies and not so performing software companies. What are they doing differently? Right, stuff like that. So one thing they talked about was capability matrix. So a lot of times when we talk about wanting to implement something, I think long also when you're trying to skill up the organization you're working in terms of UX, you looked at maturity matrix, something like that. Maturity model.
The UX maturity model.
Yeah, maturity model. So in Accelerate, they were talking about capability model because they feel like maturity model doesn't exactly tell the organization on, just because you hit a certain maturity doesn't mean you have the skills to do certain things, for example. I'm not explaining this well. Probably can find something about this online on like capability matrix versus maturity model, something like that. But one thing you talk about accessibility, right? And one thing I've always been thinking about, where to start in terms of accessibility. Like, okay, I'm working on a web project right now and we don't have accessibility, and where to even start?
I guess if you are talking about from a personal or individual contributor perspective, it's always what you could influence during your code. So going back like where to start, I think it's the same as you want to push for any kind of changes in an organization. You want to do a top down or you want to bottom up or both.
Let's say, yes, we know accessibility is something we want to do and like everybody agree, but what's the first step to take?
Learn about it first.
That's the thing. What to learn? Accessibility is huge, right? Do I need to learn about colors, or do I? That's one thing. I like, for example, if I work on a web project, I don't know. Yeah, accessibility is important. It's great, but where do I start? Like, do I add like a end-to-end testing that includes accessibility? Talking more about an engineer's perspective rather than like an organization. Like everybody agrees accessibility is important, but where do I start?
I don't think I have a good answer for that, but at least it depends on the platform that you work on. Let's say as an engineer, I guess you would have more influence if you are on the front end, but if you are working on the back end, you also might need to support or empower your front end to do all the accessibility stuff. If, let's say, the most common platform, web, you have guides that you can refer to, web content, accessibility guide. Start from there, I guess. Check through your HTML semantics, check through your designs, contrast, check your font size. Just follow the guide. I guess that's a good start.
Yeah, I guess like, okay, for example, like thinking on a pure engineering perspective, right? Of course, I will learn like automated tests to like test all these things. Then what you mentioned now is a good way for me to get started. Okay, let me search for tools that would automatically check like web content, whatever, accessibility guide, or you throw out linting error, or not linting lah, but accessibility errors. On like, hey, your thing not conform to this. For me, that's helpful. I'm like, okay, that's the first thing I do. Of course, purely thinking from an IC/engineer perspective, right?
Yeah, I guess that's a good point to start. Maybe I can use tools like AXE.
You mean the deodorant?
Or that. It's a tool that can help you to do some form tests. And also, let's say you want to check your CSS colors. That's WCAG contrast checker. But I think even as an IC, you would still want to convince your peer on like why you want to do this and what are the benefits. Because a lot of people think that accessibility is just for people with disability. But it's not, right? Like, it's like even for, let's say, when you're injured somehow, then you are not permanently disabled. You will still need some accessibility features to help you get through the days. And there's also even like maybe you could even convince your product manager to invest in this, because I think there's one study that like in the global population there's like 10-15% of people with some form of disability, and that's a lot, right? Like let's say you like product manager wouldn't stop supporting a browser with 10-15% of market share, right? Then why are we giving this part of the population out? There's sort of some form of convincing. So I think there's two things. Start with the tooling that you and the guide, and then the other part is like try to sell the idea, I guess.
I wanted to bring back to the maturity model and capability matrix, because I feel that a lot of times we treat accessibility as an external thing, where you imagine in terms of tickets, right? Like for example, accessibility is not an acceptance criteria as part of a feature. It's usually like an afterthought on like, oh, do these accessible things. And I think it's quite crucial in terms of our organization grow and thinking, in terms of like when we build a new screen or as part of a feature, accessibility factors need to be already considered throughout the entire design process and also engineering process. Like the designers have to take that into account, the PM has to take that into account, and then the engineers will implement it accordingly. A lot of times I see is that accessibility is a separate ticket. Make it more accessible, or fix whatever. And then a lot of times we all know this sort of work get pressed down because delivering feature is more important. But I think like Long, you keep mentioning about buy-in. I think I would like to believe that everybody knows accessibility is important. Maybe some people don't, I don't know. But I think the hard part is like, how do we integrate this as part of the entire development flow? That's rather than like an afterthought ticket on like doing that. I think that's where I feel the challenge is.
Introduce accessibility driven development. So because like years ago we say that tests are important, right? So we shift left tests. So we do tests first and then do development based on the test. So maybe we have like accessibility driven development. So maybe we have accessibility and test driven development.
And now security as well, right? Because security is also such a big thing, so people are shifting left on that. So
Yeah. Make sure your tests don't just test for functionality, test for accessibility, test for security as well.
wow, being an engineer is so easy. You only need to learn so many things.
I know, right? Like just everything. But yeah, maybe including it as a part of your acceptance criteria or definition of done or whatever guides they refer to.
I think when you said that accessibility is not just for those who are permanently disabled, I really do agree that it's actually improving the experience of a lot of users, not just the ones disabled, permanently or not. It's also helping those who are not disabled at all. It's actually the same with like in the real life as well, right? So for example, like elevators is probably for people with wheelchairs who cannot actually take stairs, right? But then people who don't actually use wheelchairs still go and take the elevators because it's easier.
Yeah, even for like let's say for some reason you felt physically tired or something.
Yeah, it improves everyone's experience.
I think one example I could draw is I believe this is a tool every developer will use, which is GitHub. I think GitHub in their dark mode alone, I think they offer like 4 or 5 different choices depending on how severe your color blindness is, or is there certain color blindness you have, because color blindness is a degree, right? You can either totally not see all colors or certain colors. And I mean kudos where kudos is due. I think they did a great job on like their light mode and dark mode, and also thinking about the colors and color blindness. I think that's a very good example of, like, for example, me, I use a specific, like the most quote-unquote accessible one. Like it's not really just the dark default. Like I use a specific one because it's a lot easier on the eyes, and the colors, certain things for me, certain pops out. So I choose one specific dark theme. I will agree it's not just for disabled people, anybody at all.
One of the most common example about this would be like good contrast. It benefit everyone. Even though like my visuals are okay, like even with something with bad contrast, I could still read it, but I would prefer not to because it's difficult to read. And you optimize your contrast for those who are visually impaired, then yeah, you optimize for everyone else.
Was this what you wanted to talk about, accessibility, Long? Or do you still have an itch to scratch?
I don't know. I just feel like I want to highlight accessibility more. It doesn't get talked a lot, even in tech world.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if you use Svelte or Vue or React. If your accessibility sucks, then your UX is still going to be suckier than people who use plain HTML and like inline PHP or something.
Ah, that's a nice way to wrap it.
Your users won't actually know that you use the best framework out there.
Yeah, I wanted to ask anything else before we wrap up the episode. There's like very fuzzy things I've been thinking about. It's like, so you code after work?
Do you do that?
I don't know any programmer that doesn't do that.
Side project counts, right?
Side project counts, yes.
Okay, so I guess one thing I definitely have to acknowledge, it is a privilege. Regardless what you say about it, having time to code after work is in many ways a privilege. That one I have to acknowledge.
Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't make that a criteria in your interview, for example. So like, if you're interviewing, you say that, do you code after work? If he said no and you were like, oh, he's not doing enough, then that's actually wrong.
Actually, it's even better if you fail the interview. Like if they failed you because they're like, yeah, this person doesn't code after work, like you're better off not joining this company because they might expect you to work after work, whatever that means. Maybe they work all the time, so there's no after work.
And this is also like a strange, should I call it strange? It's something that less common in other industries, that you still want to do the things you do during your day-to-day job after the work. I just want to say that it's not common, right? Like
I guess the thing people talk about is like medical, right? You wouldn't expect a doctor to like, do perform surgery after work. But it's very different as well. You have to remember doctor studies for years before they even start out and perform practice, right? Software engineering is like a 4-year degree.
Those industries are also heavily regulated. So my wife is a dentist, and you need to have proper clinics, basically. So if you're just taking dental job and you're just using like beds instead of dental chair, that's actually illegal.
You can't have side projects taking people's teeth out. That's a psychopath.
oh my god, that sounds so scary.
In their industry, there's something called locum. So locum is basically them doing side income from their profession. But it's still at a proper place where there's enough facilities and everything. Like in software, those are not regulated, and it's impossible to regulate anyway. I think programming has a faster feedback loop, right? So you get that dopamine hit faster. So I don't think you get that dopamine hit as fast. For example, like dental, right? It's not like something...
You get dopamine hit for pulling people's teeth out?
Yeah, dopamine hit from pulling people's teeth, like that's
a psychopath right there.
yeah, that's a psychopath. And they actually even try as best as they can to not pull your teeth because it's not replaceable, right? So you cannot grow your teeth again.
But you can always add more technical debt.
Yeah, you can always accumulate more technical debt, and you can always do a lot of metaprogramming and feel good about yourself, but even though it's actually gonna bite you in the 6 months.
Why not? My program automatically programs this object.
Well, good luck.
That's the brilliant engineering.
I've been there.
Thinking about it, like for me, my view is if a company expects you to code after work, I don't think it's a very healthy organization. That's one thing. Should you do it? Okay, emphasis on should. I don't think it's a requirement, but definitely there will be an improvement in your day-to-day job, in your skill, if you practice it outside. But if it's a requirement or should you do it, I don't think it is. That's how I think about it, basically. So yeah, this is the episode. Follow us on Twitter, Kopi Overflow. Follow us on all major podcast platforms, which includes Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. I wanted to say, make your copy more accessible.
Don't be discouraged to follow us even though there's only 3 episodes left.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's it. Don't let your copy overflow.